This is the Extreme Stewardship Podcast, where we explore anything and everything that gets us better at making things good and good at making things better. Right now, I'm trying to get better at understanding and participating in the conversation that a lot of people are having about the theology of work. So in these episodes, I am reading through and reflecting on a bunch of books on the theology of work. What I like, what I don't like, what I'm still thinking about. I am in the process of writing my own book on the theology of work, and this is an opportunity for me to think out loud about what other people have said on that topic. Now, the book for this episode is called Worth Doing, subtitle Fallenness, Finitude, and Work in the Real World. And this book stands apart from the others that I have done because it is a theology of work, but it is also very much a kickback against what some would call the faith and work movement of the last few decades. So the primary point of this book is to say that a lot of the stuff the faith and work movement has given us is wrong, or it is at least idealistic and naive and not in relation to, as they say in the subtitle, the real world. So what I'm going to do in this episode is walk through some of the major points that they make, the specific things that they claim have happened in the faith and work movement that are problematic. And the first one, probably the biggest one, is the idea that, as I've mentioned before in this podcast many times, books on the theology of work will always tell the story in four basic movements: the goodness of work in creation, the corruption of work under sin, the redemption of work through what Jesus accomplished, and the restoration of work in the new creation. And David Buschart and Ryan Tafilowski, who wrote this book, Worth Doing, their essential claim is that the faith and work movement is pretending that we're either still in the garden or already in eternity. And we're not. So there's a few different angles they come at this with. So I'm going to start on page 161, where they mention what they call an over-realized eschatology. For those not familiar with such things, an over-realized eschatology is saying that Jesus has accomplished certain things, which we all agree with. Those are preparing us for eternity, we all agree with. But there's this sense that they have leaned too far such that they're pretending we're already in eternity, that God has fully realized, fully accomplished things more than he has in fact done. And so I've mentioned before in this podcast, Andy Crouch, in speaking of his book Culture Making, he gives a list of things that he thinks will make it into eternity, specific human endeavors that are going to make the cut somehow. And he gives his list, and Tafilowski and Buschart say it is difficult to see what kind of exegetical warrant this kind of speculation might claim. In other words, you'd like to think, and I'll read some of the specifics here, that Miles Davis and Arvo Pärt, Spiegel im Spiegel, and creme brulee and fish tacos and iPods are going to make the cut, and we just don't see that in the Bible. It's a cute idea, not sure where you're getting it from biblically. They go on to say, in relation to this idea that eschatology informs our work to the degree that some have made it to do, they go to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians when Paul is speaking of the purpose and value of work and encouraging Christians to work in certain ways. They say this: Paul makes no appeal whatsoever to protology, meaning how things began, or eschatology, meaning how things will end, to ground his theology of work. Rather, it is simply something that must be done to serve various instrumental purposes, like providing for one's kin or contributing to the financial life of the body of Christ. So if you ask Paul, why does work happen? What are we doing? He doesn't go to Genesis or Revelation. He just simply says, hey, this is what needs to happen in the meantime. So their argument is if we over-index on the beginning or the end, we're not going about our theology of work in the way that, say, Paul himself would do. Going back a ways in the book to page 95, they will say this: none of us knows firsthand what life in the garden was like. We have only heard stories, echoes of a rumor. That is to say, even though we can read about the world's origin story, humanity has, quote, lost the beginning, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer puts it. Humankind now finds itself in the middle, knowing neither the end nor the beginning, and yet knowing that it is in the middle. So they're saying, look, we can read about the garden. We've never been in the garden. We're not currently in the garden, so we cannot simply pretend that work should work the way it did in the garden. We are also, again, not in the new creation. We have some vague indications of what it will be like when we get there, but we are not there. And it is foolish to pretend that work can already be as though we were there. Now, alongside of that, then, they also make this point by saying that we just have not taken the effects of sin seriously. So this is on page 100. He says, "It is our contention that for all its strengths, which are many, the preponderance of existing faith and work literature has, quote, not yet considered how heavy the weight of sin is," drawing that phrase from Anselm of Canterbury. So they're looking at how we talk about work, and we're using the garden and the new creation to make it all sunshine and rainbows, and it's not. Because Genesis 3 is part of the story as well, and they are naming the faith and work movement as a whole as having not taken Genesis 3 with nearly enough seriousness. The negative effect of this is that when we say, hey, work is the meaning of life, and this is how we find purpose, and it's wonderful, and we improve creation, we do all these things, and we did them in the beginning, we're going to do them in the end, and it's all great, and then we go to work, and it doesn't play out that way, we realize that the ideas of work in the beginning and the end are not playing out in our own day. And so they say this: the ethereal idea of work is always instantiated in concrete jobs. Many people like the idea of work in theory, but dislike their jobs in practice. And so they go to one definition of work from a theologian that says work is any necessary and meaningful task that God calls and gifts a person to do, which can be undertaken to the glory of God and for the edification and aid of human beings, be inspired by the Holy Spirit, and foreshadowing the realities of the new creation. Well, that's a glorious definition of work, and they're saying, yeah, sounds great, not real life, not real world. And the reason it's not real life, not real world, is that these definitions are not taking sufficient account of the fact that we don't live in the garden, we don't live in the new creation, rather we are still under the dominion of sin. Now, there's going to have to be a longer discussion on this podcast later about the specific way that eschatology informs our notion of work. And if you're familiar with these conversations, you may have heard of premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism. And the distinctive theology of the end that has informed a lot of theology of work today is postmillennialism. And postmillennialism, you might say, has the most positive account of the direction of the world post the coming of Christ until the return of Christ. So a postmillennial has theologically the most space to say, man, this is so good. Things are going well. Things are getting better. The good work that God has given humans to do is really happening, and we just keep going at it until he returns. And there's a way for a postmillennial to say that is a little bit harder for someone who takes one of the other views. And I just want to point out, this book is definitively not postmillennial. And I'll read this part. This is on page 121. They say, theological accounts of work cannot appeal to Genesis 1 and 2 as if Genesis 3 did not happen, nor can they appeal to Revelation 21 as if the New Jerusalem, a genuine novum that comes down from God, not a perfection of human culture that builds up to God, were somehow realizable through human technique. Instead, it is our contention that the proper place to situate a theology of work is squarely in chapter 2, phase 2 of the narrative, which is the corruption of work. So the point there is, you can't pretend Genesis 3 doesn't happen, and you also, eschatologically, cannot pretend that we are gradually moving toward the New Jerusalem, because their reading of Revelation is that the New Jerusalem comes down just boom from God as what they call a genuine novum. One another analogy for this might be a postmillennial will view the progression of history as something like a ramp. Certainly not a smooth one that always is cleanly progressing upwards, but there is a gradual movement from lower to higher, whereas other views of eschatology are going to view human history as more like a stair step. We are flat. We are not just gradually progressing upwards, and then there is this straight up line that happens when God does a new revelatory thing. And again, Buschart and Tafilowski are locating themselves at least outside of the postmillennial view. Therefore, we should not be looking at the movement of human history right now as a gradual unfolding or a gradual upgrading toward the conditions of the new creation. And they think that much literature and conversation on the theology of work has missed this point about how eschatology really happens. The second thing they mentioned, so the first one is we are not in the garden, we are not in eternity, we are in the middle of phase 2 with some phase 3 going on, which means mostly just dominion of sin. Ecclesiastes, it's all absurd. That's just what real world life is like. That's the first point they make. The second point is that the theology of work movement has a tendency to cater to what they call it the creative class. And they use two different ways of doing this, and I think there's some distinction. I think there should be more distinction that they make. Sometimes they'll talk about the creative class, and sometimes they'll talk about blue collar versus white collar or no collar. And I don't like the juxtaposition of those two contrasts. So if there's creative class and there's the rest of us, and then there's white collar versus blue collar, it is certainly not the case that white collar work is creative and blue collar work is not. I will say my work now is very white collar for the most part. I'm an academic. I sit at a desk. I think, I write, I speak, I teach, I have meetings, I do Zoom calls, I go to coffee shops. So that's the life that I'm in professionally. My former profession for a short period of time was in the building industry, and I was a construction grunt for a while, and then I was in cabinets. And I will say my departure from building cabinets was not because I was not physically up to the job. I was 27 years old. I could lift things, I could build things, I could swing hammers, and I can use tools. And so physically, I was perfectly fine doing that kind of work. The part of cabinet making that was the hardest for me was the intellectual side. It was the mental acuity side. It was the creative class kind of work within the blue-collar field that was the biggest struggle. So I'll say a little bit more in a second about the creative class dynamic, but I like that. I like that they said this movement has catered to the creative class. I don't think the blue-collar, white-collar contrast is as helpful. So let me just notice a couple things here. This is on page 125. They say this: much contemporary faith and work literature has thematized the concept of co-creation in ways that threaten to alienate workers whose jobs do not entail high degrees of agency or creative freedom. So if we name what we're doing in the world as co-creation, which perhaps we could do, they say the problem with that is not everybody's job is all that creative. In the last episode, I reflected a bit on David Jensen's book called Responsive Labor, and he critiques the co-creative notion of work, maybe from a different angle. Jensen says this: the problem with notions of co-creativity is that they may inadvertently emphasize the agency of the creature at the expense of the creator. That's page 41 of his book, Responsive Labor. And his issue there is that when we exalt humanity's role to the point that we call it co-creation, the danger is that we are making us equals with God in some way that is entirely out of step with the biblical story. And I think there's something important in that critique. Buschart and Tafilowski are making a different critique of co-creativity in that we are naming creativity, by which we mean lots of agency and freedom, and I get to invent things, and I get to design things, and I get to exercise my personality by the way that I work. This extent to which our work is free in its creativity, they are saying what you do when you highlight that is you name the many workers who do not have a high degree of creative freedom as somehow lesser workers. And I think that is a valid and important critique, particularly in my workspaces, in which things like personality assessments, things like self-authoring and self-discovery are of very high value, very high impact. Not because it's wrong to have a sense of your personality type. I think those tools can be very helpful. Or not that it's wrong to pursue a certain sort of role in your job that you think best fits in line with how God wired you to work. I'm all for all of that. But where I think they've said something helpful is not only does not all work have a lot of creative space to it, and there's nothing wrong with that, it is also the case that not everybody wants that. Jensen, as I mentioned before in his book Responsive Labor, one of his solutions to this is he wants workers at all levels to be given higher degrees of creative freedom and influence and voice and ownership within their workplaces. And there's some economic theory behind that I'm not going to get into here, but the struggle I have with it is not everybody wants that. The idea that it's inherently good for workers to have maximum input on the conditions of their work, on the creative elements on their work, on the broader pictures that are involved in large organizations and so forth, I think is just missing how many people there are who say, look, I just want to get the thing done. I'm going to do it well. You're going to get my full investment at this level of the organization. I don't want to be in the boardroom. I don't want to be in the C-suite. I have no interest whatsoever in having a voice in those highly creative conversations that have to do with the future of the organization and the finances of the organization. I'm not interested in that. That, I don't think, is an effect of the fall. I think that's the way God wired us. Some of us are more interested in being in the room for that conversation. Some of us are not at all interested in being in the room for that conversation, and I think that is a good thing. So, again, the second issue that they explore in this book is that there's an over-catering to what they call the creative class of workers. The third one comes out in the title of the book, the subtitle, Fallenness, Finitude, and Work in the Real World. On page 5, this will set the stage a little bit. Page 5, they say, we come on to the scene in Chapter 2 of a 4-act drama, sometimes called the grand narrative. Creation, Chapter 1, Fall, Chapter 2, Redemption, Chapter 3, Consummation, Chapter 4. So the same 4-part story that I've been telling about work. And then they say, though we've been told about Chapter 1, none of us have ever experienced it. And though we've heard rumors of Chapter 4, none of us have ever seen it. Accordingly, any realistic theology of work will need first to attend to the sheer finitude of human creatures, our fundamental boundedness, while also reckoning with the phenomenology of sin, the ways in which sin twists and malforms the very fabric of reality. A realistic theology of work then will need to make the experience of finitude methodologically prime, since the experience of finitude is universal, and it will need to make fallenness methodologically prime, since the experience of the majority of workers reflects Genesis 3, not Genesis 1 and 2. So the point is, there are two things that they think the theology of work movement, the faith and work movement, is frequently either missing or understating. One is sin, of course. The world does not operate according to the rules given it in Genesis 1 and 2, and we are not yet in the new creation. Sin is still here, for real, having an effect on our work. And then also finitude, which means you and I are finite creatures with boundaries and limits apart from sin. I'm not the creator. I'm not God. I am a finite creature. And the encouragement of this book is to name those things and be thankful for those things. The complication comes, this is not a critique of the book, but merely my reflection on it. The complication becomes in knowing which feature of my existence currently is which. Is this an issue because I am finite, or is this an issue because I am fallen? It's not always obvious which of the two it is. And it makes quite a big deal of difference, because if it's an issue of finitude, then I should simply name it and be thankful for it and acknowledge it. Yep, I am not God, and go from there. But if it's a condition of fallenness, I still need to name it, but I name it as something to be fought back against, not as something to smile and nod and be grateful for. So I appreciate very much them saying, hey, these are two things that the theology of work sometimes forgets about, the theology of work movement sometimes forgets about. But I want to know how we know which it is in any given case, and I'd like to see more about that. The fourth issue is their suggestion that the faith and work movement is often naive a bit about what they call techne, and others have used this Greek word. It means something like tools. So this was a big word back a few episodes in Doug Wilson's book called Productivity. He's the one who says that if you have a phone in your pocket, you have 10,000 servants at your beck and call. And I mentioned back in that episode, the problem with that way of saying it is that we forget that those 10,000 servants are in active rebellion against us. And Tafilowski and Buschart are going to go a little bit deeper into this. So they say this on page 115. They mention Karl Barth, great theologian of the mid-20th century, who thematized these concepts of sin's effects on things through an exploration of what he calls lordless powers. And by lordless powers, here I'm quoting the book, Barth means products of human culture that, having taken on a life of their own, end up enslaving humans. Interestingly, Barth enumerates among the powers entities that Christians sometimes regard as, quote, neutral: sports, transportation, political philosophies, money, industry, economy, and I would add, they don't mention it here, but they mention it elsewhere, I would add things like technology. The idea that these are simply beautiful gifts of God to be put to good use, and it's just not that complicated, it is that complicated. It's complicated not because these are not good gifts of God. These lordless powers are functions of culture. They are deep down good things, but they are not objective. They are not neutral. They are not simply sitting there to be used for good or for ill. They are, as Barth says, lordless powers actively having taken on a life of their own and actively enslaving humans along the way. So I just really appreciated their pushback on that point. These tools that we have can be used for good, but they call them ambiguous, I think, with good reason. The last critique they offer is pushback against the idea that we as humans are what we do. Now, I don't mind saying on this podcast, as I've defined work as improving creation, as the primary task on earth of those who are made in God's image, I probably come very close to saying you are what you do, as long as we've defined work properly. They say this, they call this a toxic mythology, in which you are what you do is a view in which work is the primary means by which humans present themselves to the world and attempt to solidify their identities. I'd say I'm very close to saying that is precisely what work is. It is a primary means by which humans present themselves to the world. It is an attempt to solidify our identities if we define it in terms of stewardship, if we define it in terms of being created by God, if we define it in terms of improving creation, not just in terms of job or employment or paycheck. But I also want to say my work is an indication of who I am, not because my work is inherently me or that I can inherently become what I want through my work, but because I have been loved by God. God did not create me just to do work. He created me to be a recipient of his love. Now, surely Buschart and Tafilowski would say, yeah, that's not how life seems to play out either. Fair enough, conversation for another time. But I simply want to say, if the danger is putting work too deeply into what it means to be human, I think I actually want to put work very deeply into what it means to be human, as long as work is a mission that is framed by the ultimate why of God created us to receive his life and love, and work is a significant component of how we receive and convey that life and love to others. So, 5 particular critiques. First one, we're not in the garden and we're not in the new creation. Second one, theology of work too often just goes with creative class and ignores everybody else. Third, the theology of work movement, the faith and work movement, have too little to say about the good limitations of finitude and the not so good but real limitations of fallenness. 4, the faith and work movement is often naive about non-neutral tools in the world that have become these lordless powers that enslave us through a life of their own. And then fifthly, they think the theology of work movement has placed work too deeply into the fundamentals of what it means to be human. And there's a lot about this book that I appreciate. I will go back to the first one for a moment and say that they point out that the faith and work movement has over-capitalized on phase 1, the garden, phase 4, the new creation, and underutilized phase 2, the conditions of sin. I agree with that. That's fair. On the other hand, they want to say that phase 2 actually should be the foundation of our theology of work. We should start from the middle. We should start with real lived experience and only then say things later about the garden and the new creation. And I disagree with that. Not because I don't think we should say more about phase 2, but because there is a long and I think valid tradition in the history of Christian systematic theology where we move in a certain direction from God to us. And if you start your theology of work with God, you're not going to start with the human conditions of work under sin. You're going to start with Genesis 1. And if you end with God, you're going to end in the new creation. And in the middle, not at the beginning, not at the end, not as an afterthought certainly, but also not as the cornerstone, we're going to talk about sin. So I agree with them that we need to say more about phase 2. I do not agree that it should be the first thing that we talk about and everything else should flow from there. I appreciated their critique of the naivete with respect to how wonderful work can be and with respect to how neutral tools are. And then I appreciated their call to frame our limits as functions of finitude or fallenness. And I want to add that I think we need to do more, first of all, to identify which limitations belong to which category, because that has enormous implications for how we respond to them. If it is finitude, we name it and we embrace it. And if it is fallenness, we name it and oppose it. And that, I think, is all I have to say about that. The book, one more time, is Worth Doing, Fallenness, Finitude, and Work in the Real World by David Buschart and Ryan Tafilowski. It's good. You should read it. There's a lot of valuable stuff in it beyond what I've talked about in this episode. There is an Amazon link in the show notes to purchase it if you are so inclined. So get the book, read the book, do what it says, and you will get better at your work. And until next time, thanks for listening to the Extreme Stewardship Podcast. My name is Michael Kibbe, and I teach Bible and theology at Great Northern University in Spokane, Washington. My behind-the-scenes partner in this endeavor is Ben Kibbe, CEO of Kibbe Consulting in Columbiana, Ohio. Our editor-in-chief is Liam Olmsted. Art comes from Steve Kearns, and music is provided by Dave Murray of Derridoon Guitars. If this podcast has been useful or challenging to you, shoot us an email, extremestewards@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you think it might be useful or challenging to anyone else, well, you know what to do. And ultimately, we hope that listening to this podcast has helped you get better at making things good and good at making things better.